All right, so welcome everyone to the Future of Work Dialogues, Narratives from South and Southeast Asia. This is a panel on gender, labor, and inequality in the context of technological change in South and Southeast Asia. We're very lucky to have three distinguished panelists for this conversation, who I will introduce in a moment. But first, I wanted to introduce Ramiro Alburu, who is from CIPPEC in Argentina, which is the institution that is organizing or chairing this initiative of the Future of Work Dialogues. And I want to ask Ramiro to start us off by introducing what these dialogues are about and sort of what the broader FOWIGS initiative is trying to achieve. So Ramiro, perhaps you can sort of start us off and introduce this.
Thanks, Gregory. Hi, everyone. Good morning or good evening. I don't know. Yeah, let me give you just a summary of our initiative on the future of work in the Global South. We have been working on trying to get new research and new data on the future of work for our countries, for the countries in the Global South, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and of course, Asia. And we have been producing a lot of papers and data, but we realized that there was this global narrative on the future of work, reaching the academics, reaching governments, and reaching also multilateral organizations, saying that against the fears of robots taking over, okay, this narrative says something like we can manage technological change in order to create better jobs, to manage inequality, and so on, right? I mean, this narrative is very powerful now, saying that over the long run, we will get, more innovation, more inclusiveness, thanks to these new technologies. And in our project, we ask ourselves, is this narrative is past? We are the Global South because we fail to take advantage of these opportunities. That's why we are not the Global North. So in a way, this global narrative is saying that if we repeat the past, that's the right way to succeed. The right path is just repeating previous industrial revolutions. But for us in the Global South, we need to do things differently this time. We need to change history, not repeat history, right? So that's why we move our project. Instead of finding research, we try to go for these dialogues, where experts from different topics, we can say from technology, from skills, from labor market institutions, even from demographics, start thinking together about what the future of work could be in our regions, right? The idea is not to antagonize or with the global narrative, but just to add context, add diversity, just to ask our own questions. That's why we have been producing and co-hosting these dialogues. We had our dialogues in Sub-Saharan Africa about a month ago, the dialogues about the future of work in Latin America about 3 weeks ago, and we had the dialogues on the future of work in the Middle East and North Africa about 2 weeks ago. So we are in a way finalizing our road trip of trying to understand the future of work. Again, the idea of these dialogues is not to create a new narrative or totally different from the North, or to just present our papers, but to think about what do we know about the future of work, where are the blind spots about the future of work, which are the answers and the questions that we have in our own regions regarding all these topics, So I'm very happy to be here trying to listen and learn from you from this panel about your own Asian perspectives on the future of work. So thanks for being here. Thanks for inviting me. And if you want to know more, just you can email me, or you can Google 4 weeks like the future of work in the global South, and you can find our papers, our data, these narrative building exercises that we are performing now. So again, thanks, and just ready to listen and learn.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Ramiro. And I'll just mention that Just Jobs Network, my institution, is very happy to partner with you in this initiative and to represent sort of the perspective of South and Southeast Asia in these dialogues. Just a quick introduction to who I am. I am the founding partner at Just Jobs Network, and we're a global policy research institute that works on labor and employment issues, and in particular, addressing questions around transformations in work due to technology, but also other major trends of the 21st century, like urbanization, migration, climate change, really trying to understand what these changes mean for the global imperative to create more and better jobs. And we've been working with CIPPEC and other institutions on these questions through our global network of research partners. You'll get to hear a little bit more about one of our projects in particular that Jamme, one of our panelists, is leading. So without any more delay, I'm excited to start this discussion. As I mentioned, today's discussion is really looking at technological disruption, technological change in labor markets through the lens of gender. So we're going to be thinking about what the gendered impacts of technological change are along many different dimensions, thinking about deindustrialization, automation in manufacturing, the growth of algorithmic or algorithm-based management practices, and the growth of new employment arrangements like the platform economy. We're going to be thinking about all of these changes through the lens of gender. And in particular, we're going to be sort of focusing in on this proliferation of platform economy firms, platform-based employment arrangements, and what they might mean for women's work. And we're going to be thinking in particular about what it means for women to work on these platforms from home, what this sort of changes about the nature of home-based work, which has often been sort of thought to be a policy solution for engaging more women in the workforce. And we'll also think about sort of what types of policy actions are necessary in order to shape and channel these new technologies and to regulate them. So we have three very distinguished panelists. I'm really excited about this panel because all three of our panelists are both scholars and practitioners, and they come from diverse sort of intellectual and research backgrounds. We have an anthropologist, an economist, and a geographer urban planner. So it's very multidisciplinary, I think, in the spirit of the kinds of conversations that Just Jobs tries to facilitate, and in the spirit of the CIPPEC Future of Work dialogues as well. So Bama Athreya is a fellow at the Open Society Foundations with a research focus on workers in the digital economy. And she's also a senior gender advisor to the Loudest Foundation. Most recently, she worked for the U.S. Agency for International Development as Senior Specialist for Labor, Gender, and Social Inclusion. At USAID, she led and contributed to several reports and research products, toolkits, policy guidance, and training on gender and social inclusion. And she contributed to the development of global programming to address labor rights, counter human trafficking, and promote women's economic inclusion. She is our anthropologist. She holds a PhD in social anthropology from the University of Michigan. Our second panelist is Janine Berg, who is a senior economist at the International Labor Organization in Geneva. Since joining the ILO in 2002, Janine has conducted research on the economic impacts of labor laws and provided technical assistance to ILO constituents on policies for generating jobs and improving working conditions. She's the author of several books and numerous articles on employment and labor market institutions, including a 2018 ILO report called Digital Labor Platforms and the Future of Work Towards Decent Work in the Online World, and a 2021 ILO report called Working from Home from Invisibility to Decent Work, both very relevant topics for the discussion that we're going to be having today. And she holds a PhD in economics from the New School for Social Research. And finally, I'm very excited to have Jamme as our third panelist, who is an assistant professor in the School of Geographical Sciences and Urban Planning at Arizona State University. Tam's research focuses on the lived experience of societal transformations. In particular, she explores whether the development of information and communication networks shapes inclusive urban spaces. Tam currently leads a Just Jobs research project, which is centered on the gig economy and women's upward mobility in Cambodia, Myanmar, and Thailand. Her work has been published in English and French in edited volumes in academic journals, including the Journal of Planning, Education, and Research and the Journal of Environmental Psychology. And her research and teaching draws on several years of professional practice in Asia as a consultant in urban development. So I think my point about a distinguished panel has been proven by the introductions that I just gave. This is a really, a group of 3 scholars and practitioners that bring a lot of sort of insight and expertise on this topic of gender and labor markets and technological change. So I'm really excited to have the 3 of you here. We're looking forward to an organic discussion where you're engaging with me, but most importantly with each other and the ideas that the 3 of you bring to the table. I want to sort of get us started by asking sort of some warm-up questions to each of the 3 of you that I think will hopefully draw on some of the expertise that you have and the issues that you think about in your work. And I want to start with you, Janine, and just sort of ask some questions that might help us set the stage for this discussion. I realize that these are going to be big questions that there may not be clear answers to, but I'm sure that you will help us sort of develop a framework for thinking through them. So, my first question is really around the aggregate impact of all of this technological change that we're seeing. Future of work has become this kind of important buzzword for policymakers and the private sector and labor unions. And it encompasses sort of all of these different forms of technological change, some of which I've already mentioned. We have sort of a global pattern of deindustrialization, even in a lot of developing economies, which is caused by automation and increasing kind of capital intensivity of manufacturing. We have the growth of management practices that are based on algorithms, and what Bama and her work sort of calls the disintermediation of the employment arrangement, so that workers are increasingly interfacing with robots instead of human managers. And of course, we also have the growth of these platform economy business models, or what's been called the platformization of many different sectors. So I want to start by asking a really big question, and asking about these technological changes through the lens of gender. So in your assessment, Janine, will the aggregate effect of all of these different technological changes be a widening or a narrowing of all the different gender gaps that we see in the world of work, whether it's the gap in earnings, the gap in quality of work, the gap in hours worked, all of these different gender gaps that we see? Will they widen or will they narrow as a result of all of this different technological change? And also, given that we are having this discussion from the perspective of South and Southeast Asia, is there any reason to think that the impact in this region of the world will look different from the impacts, in other regions. So a big question, but I'm sure, like I said, if it is unanswerable, that you'll at least give us some guideposts and some frameworks to think about this.
Yeah, so a really big question with no easy answers. So I'm just going to try to unpackage it a little bit and just discuss a few things, and then we can take the conversation a little bit more forward. Okay, so there's different things going on that are going to affect workers, and of course the effects will be different for workers depending on where region they live in, and then also, but there's also gender differences. So that's clear cut. And then there's different things going on. And some of these technological changes have important impacts in terms of number of jobs, so quantity, but a lot of the technological changes are really affecting quality of work, and that also has its consequences. So let me try to unpack just a little bit. So one of the trends that we see is growing automation, or even robots in the workplace. And there's all this discussion now about nearshoring. So all of what happened in globalization with manufacturing moving to the global south, this provided a lot of work opportunities, particularly for women in sectors such as apparel or other labor intensive sectors. There is a discussion that, with growing automation, that some of this production could then move back to the global north because it could be automated, and then the companies wouldn't have the shipping costs and the hassles of having to deal with suppliers from around the world. It's not completely clear cut whether this is going to happen. I think this is still a debate that's out there. A lot of these automation is really expensive. A lot of the labor intensive work that is being done, especially when you think of sewing, there are some things that can be sewn through a machine, but really there are some things in sewing that can never be done by a machine. It would be very costly to program machines for all the different types of, when you think of clothing, all the different types of styles that are created, embroidery as well. These are things that are really difficult to automate. So it's not completely clear whether this means that all of these mainly female manufacturing jobs in the global south, and particularly in Asia, are going to move back to the global north. I think there will be some movement. I mean, I think there is some of that is true. And of course, that would have a negative impact on women in the global south working in these jobs. But I think a lot of this discussion about all of the jobs disappearing is exaggerated. Now, that doesn't mean that policymakers should ignore these trends. And I think if anything, hopefully it's a little bit of a wake-up call to countries in the global south, because they do need to diversify their economies and they do need to become more self-sufficient. I mean, right now, we have a globalization pattern that we see with the COVID-19 pandemic, which is very much dependent on kind of these narrow global supply chains that causes a lot of weaknesses for the global north, but also for the global south in terms of their imports as well. So perhaps there's going to be a movement now for countries, or at least regions, to be a little bit more self-sufficient, maybe to have some more of their own manufacturing and not be importing from other parts of the world. So if, with the right policy and investment in mind, I don't think these automation trends are necessarily going to be negative. And the other thing just to keep in mind in this debate, I lived for a long time in Dominican Republic when I was a child, and there's power outages all the time. And there still are power outages there, and there's still power outages all over the global south. And so, there is this very much a cost benefit analysis to how much can be automated in the global south versus how cheap labor is and how cheap energy is. And so I think all of these different factors have to be taken into account before we can kind of say what the effect is going to be, yes or no. Okay, so now one of the other trends has to deal with platformization, which is also kind of related to the algorithmic management. So one of the things that we've been seeing, and which my colleagues and myself have written about, and also some of the other panelists in this discussion have written about, is the rise of home-based platform work. So this would be people located in the global south who are, let's say, training artificial intelligence systems, doing tagging, verifying Twitter accounts, doing translation, statistical work. There's a whole range of work that's being done by home-based workers in the global south, across the world. So what we see, I mean, it could potentially be a really good opportunity for many workers in the global South. It gives them access to employment opportunities in the global North without having to migrate. So that's certainly a positive thing. But there's also some negatives around this type of work. There's a lot of competition. There's an oversupply of workers on these platforms. We see, compensation isn't that great, even for workers in the global South, as many of these workers are highly educated. And of course, this is a very somewhat informal employment relationship with no labor protection. So workers basically consent to the terms of agreement, and the money is deposited in their account, or they're paid through PayPal or some other form. So this means that there's risks that the person that they've been providing the work for might disappear, depending on how the platform's set up. But there are risks that they've provided labor and then they don't get paid, and they have nobody to turn to contest not being paid. It also means that, if there's no maternity protection, there's no sickness protection, there's all these other protections that are lacking. So there really is a need to make these jobs good jobs. And that requires some sort of international governance, given that these are international platforms. So I think that that's something that the world really needs to be thinking about. How, this is a new form of working. We're living in a digital age where we're all communicating via Zoom, and we can work seamlessly across borders, but our labor governance systems are very much nation-based. And so this is a problem in terms of ensuring decent work for the workers. So there again, it's hard to say whether it's going to be good or bad. There is a lot of talk about how women benefit from a lot of this home-based platform work, and I think we're going to discuss that later. So I don't want to take up too much of the time in the beginning, but there's some trade-offs there. So I think maybe I'll leave that for further on in the discussion about whether is this a boom for women or not. I think there's certainly advantages, but there's also disadvantages that we need to discuss. And then the final point that you made, I think you mentioned also about the algorithmic management, very much related also to a lot of the platforms work this way. This is something that's really about job quality, again, because workers don't have a voice. They don't have a human manager. If something goes wrong, they don't have somebody to turn to. And that really deteriorates the quality of employment. So these are things that really require policy responses. So I think if I would say anything about how this is going to turn out, it really depends on how policymakers respond to these challenges, and if we respond, in a way that can ensure that these changes in the world of work are for the benefit of workers.
Great, thanks so much for a comprehensive overview of the different trends that I mentioned, and sort of thinking a little bit about how they will impact labor markets and women in particular. I want to just ask you a follow-up question that came to mind when you were talking about sort of how the pandemic, how the COVID-19 pandemic might change sort of industrial strategies or manufacturing policies around the world. And I think this is a really interesting question because, as you mentioned, all of the disruption to global supply chains is in some ways causing countries to sort of rethink or at least reconsider some of the assumptions that we've had over the last 30 years about what a good manufacturing or industrial strategy looks like. And we could, as you mentioned, see both countries in the global north and in the global south decide to sort of bring back certain types of manufacturing that might have been outsourced into these complex global value chains in the past, so that they are more self-sufficient when it comes to manufacturing certain kinds of goods. And I'm just wondering what you think the impact of that would be for labor markets in sort of South and Southeast Asia, and particularly those that create a lot of, particularly those sectors that create a lot of jobs for women. Because on the one hand, if a lot of countries in the global north start deciding to bring back certain sectors, for example, PPE or these kinds of necessary equipment that become very critical in the context of a pandemic, this could sort of mean jobs moving out of those countries. On the other hand, we know from the past that, you know, import substitution kinds of industrialization strategies have also been beneficial in certain ways in the global south. So if global south countries are deciding to reshore some of their manufacturing, that could be a boon as well. So how can we think about some of the impact on quantity of jobs, especially in sort of feminized sectors, in response to some of the concerns that emerged during the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right in that the sectors that are most likely to be affected are medical, pharmaceuticals, and food production. I think is another critical sector where, you know, countries don't want to be in a situation where food is not being delivered. So whether to what so that is probably, I mean, some of those occupations are feminized, but I don't know if there's there might be some sort of gender dimension there. I'm not exactly sure. Really the most labor intensive, I mean, it's mainly the labor intensive manufacturing that's feminized. And I think that could play either way. So it could be hard. It depends a little bit on how dependent the country is on that. So if you think of a country like Bangladesh, where it's, you know, highly dependent on the ready-made garment sector, if a lot of that were to move away, that would certainly be a negative impact. On the other hand, I think from a development point of view, if countries in the global south can kind of reawaken their industrial policies to focus on some of the production that could be done in their home countries, I think that's actually beneficial. It would increase know-how. We would have more diverse economies. They wouldn't, in terms of macro policy, they wouldn't be so dependent on the foreign exchange to be buying all of these goods from the global north. So I think, I'm not sure what the gender implications are, but I think overall it would be a good thing. My concern, though, is that the economic fallout from the pandemic has been so much more devastating for the global south in terms of debt levels and a pressing need for debt restructuring. And so a lot of the countries in the global south are really going to be coming out of this pandemic very highly indebted. And unless there is kind of an international solidarity to deal with this, it's going to be hard for those countries to have the necessary income to invest in their domestic sector. So it's something that I think would be really wonderful if it could happen, and I hope it does happen, but I think it's actually going to be difficult in a lot of countries.
Yeah, and the other question I had for you, Janine, is around sort of these dimensions of quality of work. You know, a lot of the trends that we just talked about, you emphasize the fact that they will, that they're having a sort of, you know, deleterious impact on quality of work, and that, you know, we see an erosion of quality of work in a lot of different sectors as a result of new technologies, or, you know, perhaps that the new jobs that are being created are not very high quality. And one question I have here is, I mean, we know that historically women's work has always been more likely to be informal, more likely to be precarious, more likely to be you know, contingent and or unpaid even. And so as we see sort of technological change that erodes the quality of work overall in the labor market and impacts both men and women, is it possible that we could see kind of a narrowing of the gender gap, but not for good reason? I mean, a narrowing in the sense that men's work gets worse and gets closer to looking like the kind of work that women have been doing for a long time, and that we could sort of see a narrowing of the gender gap for the wrong reasons, or for undesirable reasons. Is that a possible outcome of all of this technological change?
Yeah, I mean, I think it could be a possibility, especially since the technological change, to the extent that it also weakens workers' bargaining power, those who are at the bottom of the pay scale, then it would be kind of, there would be this narrowing and this worsening. So I think the really important lesson is that with all of the kind of the alternative employment arrangements, let's call it that, the non-standard work, whether it be temporary, part-time, even freelance work, that sort of thing, the importance is to improve those the conditions of those works, and then you would help women and men, and of course you would disproportionately help women more because there are more women in those jobs. So policies such as minimum wage policies, for example, it affects all the workers at the bottom if it's a national minimum wage, but it helps women more, it helps minorities or migrant workers more. So I think that the lesson here is really that we need to improve these non-standard working arrangements and make them good jobs. There's no reason just because a job is shorter hours or temporary or whatever the arrangement is that it has to be a poor quality job. You can have these jobs be good quality jobs, but you can't let the market do that. You're going to have some sort of intervention. You're going to have to get rid of thresholds so that there aren't cutoffs in the social security system. You're going to have equal treatment laws so that someone who's working part-time or someone who's working full-time would have access to the same level of benefits. And if you put those regulations in place, then these kind of more precarious jobs become less precarious, and that helps all workers, but it particularly helps women who tend to be more represented in those jobs.
Great. Yeah, I think it's a very important point to think about, sort of, improving job quality from the bottom up, and that kind of has the potential to benefit all different kinds of workers, but especially those who are concentrated in those kinds of precarious jobs. Before I switch to asking some of the other warm-up questions that I had for other panelists, I just wanted to see if Bama or Huitam had any reactions to some of the insights that Janine just shared, or if there's anything that you want to respond to before we kind of shift gears and focus a little bit in more detail on the platform economy. No, okay, that's fine. So we'll go ahead and shift gears and talk in a little bit more detail about some of the work that both Bama and Huitam have been doing, looking specifically at the platform economy. And I'm sure that Janine will also re-enter the conversation in this regard, because you've done a lot of work on these topics as well. So, so Bama, I want to turn to you, and you recently authored a very interesting report, a paper called "Bias In, Bias Out: Gender and Work in the Platform Economy." So first of all, thank you for this paper. It's informed a lot of my thinking on these issues, and informed a lot of the sort of direction that I want to take this discussion. In this paper, you argue that, quote, "the introduction of new technologies into the economy will not correct longstanding power imbalances," end quote. And you argue that the digital economy, and specifically the platform economy, is reinforcing and even amplifying certain kinds of gender disparities. So can you kind of explain, as a way of starting this discussion, what you mean by that and how that works? Why is that happening, and how?
Great, thank you so much, Greg, and it's such a pleasure to be here. And yeah, I'm ready to jump right into that question, and actually quite excited. I'm going to tag Huitam right away, because one of the issues that I am going to surface is one where I'm particularly interested in your comments as an urban geographer, and that has to do with the invisible social constraints. I mean, we can think about space, but what are the invisible constraints? So let me back up for just a minute to give you one piece of framing that I think is really important here. We're talking about a 21st century economy, a digital economy, but it hasn't just emerged, right, on a blank slate. We are layering it onto centuries of discrimination and patriarchy. And so I don't want to, as we talk about the future, don't want to pretend that the past has been all rosy, because it hasn't. Women have long been relegated to the lowest waged work, where they have been in the waged sector at all. We'll talk about unpaid care work, and we'll certainly talk about the disproportionate numbers of women in the informal economy. So that's nothing new, and it's not accidental. And I think it's important, therefore, to recognize as we shift to talking about algorithms and what we might see as the new invisible hand, that the old invisible hand may have been invisible, but it was not inevitable. It was intentionally part of a longstanding social construct that assigned different weight to different occupations and tasks that were gendered and have always been gendered. Okay, so on that footing, moving on, what I'm really sort of interested in and want to raise is the way in which social space, has served to reinforce certain constraints around what women can and cannot do in the world of work. Gender-based violence has been treated as an episodic problem, but it's actually a systematic problem. And it's a function of social norms designed to constrain women's mobility and to reinforce what has long been, an unpaid care burden that is frankly required for the continued functioning of our society. So you've got this, sort of normative, construction of gender-based violence that's used to constrain where women can walk, what they can say, how they can appear, in context after context, and that affects where women show up in the world of work and how they work. So now that we're creating new modes of connecting women with work through digitization and through platforms, we are seeing, at least what I've seen in anecdotal evidence, evidence that online gender-based violence is quite extreme and quite systematic, that it disproportionately affects and even pushes out women from certain types of occupations. Women journalists, for instance, have been so severely and systematically under threat of gender-based violence that it has a genuine chilling effect on their ability to do their jobs. Okay, so that's just one example. We don't know the extent to which this is replicated in a pervasive online experience for women in other types of work which require them to be online. But we just know that the overall phenomenon for any woman who is on any social media platform is so widespread and so systematic, and is being exacerbated over time by certain types of algorithms and by this, disintermediation of social relations, which you mentioned and which we can talk about further. But basically, not to make it, too complicated a term, I've borrowed that term from others, but taking apart the face-to-face communication, people will behave worse to each other when they can't see the reaction of the person that they're offending. So we've got all of this online exacerbation of gender-based violence, and we still have the physical constraints in real space of women not feeling safe to be mobile and out there in the world of work in the same ways as men. And so we therefore have certain types of self-censorship and self-policing that go on. Let's take, I've spoken to women drivers, for instance, that drive for ride-hailing platforms. Their ability to take jobs is not the same as a man on that platform, because there are certain types of passengers they're reluctant to pick up, certain zones they're reluctant to drive into, et cetera. So already the physical constraint layers onto the digital opportunity, right? Then you also have the self-censorship of women who may have access to things like the home-based platform work that Janine has described. But they have familial constraints. And again, I mean, I've seen this in reports. This was not my own research, but in other researchers' reports, the suspicion, right, by husbands or by family members. Why are you online so late at night? Who are you interacting with? So we don't know, and I think it would be good to have more evidence of the extent to which social norms constrain the extent to which women participate in online work, and where the social invisible hand reinforces, the realities of what access women have to work. And then the final thing, I'll just say one more thing, and obviously there's lots of other directions this could go, but I am curious to see how others react to this. Is that there's also, I would imagine, there's a heightened potential for online harassment in virtual spaces with coworkers that for someone like a Turker, a woman Turker. We don't know, and I haven't seen, and perhaps others on this panel have seen research to show us, is there an extent to which we're just seeing that replication of exposure to harassment, but perhaps exacerbated because in a real workspace, at this point, we do have some laws and norms in many jurisdictions that would provide some access to redress. But on a platform, there's no such access to redress. So let me stop at that because I think that's a lot to bite off at once.
Thanks very much, Bama. Sorry, I was looking for my unmute button. Thank you so much for teeing up a lot of different issues in sort of response to my question and reflecting on the work that you've done. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about before we dig into some of these specific issues that you've raised is really this question of how introducing, you mentioned that these platforms or these new employment arrangements that are emerging because of digitalization and other forms of technology, that they're kind of grafted onto existing social norms and existing divisions of labor in the labor market, and that oftentimes, the work that happens or happened off platform that was performed by women is now still gendered in many of the same ways, if not amplified by the platform. And I wanted to dig into this a little bit because I think that, the overarching observation here that women are likely to do the same forms of gendered work on platforms, whether it's, beauty services or, home-based sort of production work or these kinds of occupations that women have historically been sort of gendered into. I think that makes a lot of sense, but I also am reflecting on some research that we've done at Just Jobs Network, looking at kind of comparing those who do platform-based work with those who do the same work off the platform. And one of the things that we found is that there is a significant difference in who does platform work when it comes to things like education, age, and even socioeconomic background. And so I'm wondering, even if, women sort of continue to do the same work on the platform that they might have done off platform, do we see other differences in, the types of women who have access to this work or who end up in this work? And if we take kind of an intersectional approach to this and think about both, gender, but also other kinds of identities or other kinds of characteristics that tend to shape labor market outcomes, how does technology and technological change interact with those? I wonder if that's something that you've looked at all in your research.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. So I'll answer just by talking about a couple of examples. I think the reality is, you've done certain, research on certain segments of the population, the global labor market. I've had some access to others, and it probably looks different from different vantage points. So I think the best way to really sort of introduce some concerns for the policy audience here into this is to talk about a particular category of workers that has been a focus for me, and that is domestic workers. We are seeing the emergence of some platforms in some places to connect domestic workers with gigs, with household clients that want cleaning services. And we are starting to get some evidence in places like South Africa and Brazil and India of what types of workers are joining these platforms and the terms and conditions of work and how those stack up against the economy as a whole. Keeping in mind that domestic work is an extremely precarious sector. So again, to my earlier point, we're not saying platforms are making domestic work bad. Domestic work is not a great gig in any circumstances. But what are the qualitative differences? This is what I've been interested in. So I'm going to answer your question, and then one other question, one other just point that I think is important to put into this conversation. On your question, if we look, for instance, at who has accessed work through platforms like Sweep South in South Africa or Jamme in Brazil, we see the profile is more skewed toward migrant workers than native born workers in those countries. In Brazil, we see, for instance, Venezuelan refugees that are accessing work. And the reason is they have no social capital. And so here are workers who are, again, quite precarious, quite in dire need of economic activity. And without the social capital or word of mouth networks to access the type of clients that they need to access, the platform becomes a connector that bridges them in that absence of social capital to gigs. So the profile is actually more marginalized and more vulnerable, not more educated or more, this is less of an option, and it's more of a, I must do this because I have no other option. So that's just, again, one segment of the labor market, a couple of countries, and a data point to consider when we ask ourselves whether this technology is further exacerbating marginalization or alleviating it. It's a data point. The other thing I will add, and one thing that I've been very concerned about, is that we are not thinking enough about the ramifications of the quite enormous data sets that are being collected from the world's most marginalized workers, and how those data sets may be used by private actors in the absence of any guardrails on how they can be used. We are living in a surveillance economy. The nature of that surveillance economy is that the worker even if it's a very, again, low wage, precarious, marginalized worker, in order to access the gig, must access an app, must therefore leave a digital footprint. And the data that they've provided is the property of the company. It is not theirs. They don't know how it's, they don't have any control over how it's used. And so I think there's a huge subject here that we need to get into. I think Janine started to tee this up a little bit. And I would suggest we come back to it. What rights should those workers have over what data is collected and how it's used? And I will stop there because I know you're going to want to get other people into the conversation, but so much more to say on that point.
That's great, Bama. Thanks so much for nuancing my perspective on who's accessing this work. And I think it's important that we consider that different sectors would have different sort of impacts on in terms of who has access to different types of work and who depends on platforms. And thanks for teeing up this policy issue around data governance. It's definitely something I want to come back to as we sort of turn the discussion to thinking about policy instruments and policy measures. I want to go ahead and bring Huitam into the conversation because I think that you will bring some unique perspective here as someone who is engaged in some primary ethnographic and qualitative work in Southeast Asia, looking at some of these questions. So for our audience members, Huitam is currently leading a Just Jobs Network project that is in partnership with the Keenan Institute in Thailand, the Center for Economic and Social Development in Myanmar, and another institution in Cambodia as well. And that this work is funded by IDRC, the Canadian Research Agency, part of the Women Work and Gig Economy Consortium, which is a research consortium that Just Jobs Network manages. So my understanding, and you can give us more details, Huitam, is that this project looks at home-based platform work in Thailand, Cambodia, and Myanmar with a focus on women's work. And so I want to ask you first if you can kind of talk about why in this research you've chosen to focus on home-based work in particular, and what the different types of home-based work are that that you're looking at. And then also if you can kind of start to respond, you know, putting on your hat as a geographer and urban planner, if you can start to respond to some of the points that Bama raised around the physical mobility constraints that women face and that shape their participation in the labor market. Because I have a feeling it has to do with why you've chosen to look at home-based work in this project. So yeah, with that introduction, we'd love to hear more about the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Greg, for this introduction and for this opportunity to speak in this amazing panel. Before I answer your question, I just want to share a little bit about our progress, just to give you a sense of where we are at. The project started in February of 2020. And so far we've completed the secondary data collection, which is an analysis, which is something we could do in the context of the pandemic. But when it comes to the bulk, you know, of the data we want to collect, which really is centered on 100 interviews with workers, especially women, in each country, the start of this data collection has been a little delayed, and we just launched it a month ago in the current circumstances where in all 3 countries it's quite difficult. Of course, we are conducting our interviews online since we are dealing with a community that has access to online tools, but just the conditions of work for our data or the people who are involved in our data collection make it a little slow. So far, everything I can talk about and everything I can tell you about the results. So we have preliminary results we have from our study are based on our secondary data, such as, you know, the reports and books that Janine and Bama are working on, and also the pilot study that we conducted, which involved 3 to 5 interviews only in each country, but that did serve the purpose of framing our analysis and raising the questions that we want to address. So the evidence I can bring to the table is quite anecdotal, but I guess does speak to the issues that you have all very well laid out. So to answer your question of why home-based work, well, like Janine laid out perfectly, we are dealing with a situation where in the countries we're looking at, women have a lower participation in the labor market. So in the context of the rise of the platform economy, the question really, there is kind of a hypothesis here being raised that maybe we have here in the development world an opportunity to bring the job opportunities to the home, where the women, in the developing countries we're looking at tend to be bound due to like things we know way too well, the disproportionate burden of unpaid domestic work, and so on and so forth. So there is an opportunity here that we want to investigate with, of course, the rise of the platform economy, the rapid development of internet access. In the 3 countries we're looking at, internet access has been skyrocketing over the last 10 to 20 years, and people access basically the very large majority of the adult population is connected, especially through mobile phones. And women tend to be to have greater access to this type of connectivity than men. So we see here an opportunity to maybe see whether women take advantage of these trends to access the labor force in different ways. There's also, you know, a background underlying trend in the background where we know in these Southeast Asian countries that there is a propensity to entrepreneurship that is quite gendered as well. In Cambodia, for example, it's quite striking. The figure is quite striking. We have like between 60 and 70% of all businesses that are women owned. And yeah, so that's another like underlying trend, like background, piece of background that we think might constitute an opportunity to enhance the participation of women in the labor force in the context of technological change. I think you asked me as well about the different types of home-based platforms we are looking at, right? So we purposely selected a range of platforms. We are not focusing on specific platforms, but we are selecting workers depending on the type of platform they work on. So we have like four types of, four profiles. One is women who do e-commerce using social media platform. So that is people starting a business page on Facebook. And I would actually stick to Facebook because Facebook appears to be the dominant social media platform that they use. The second profile is people who do e-commerce using online retail platform. And the difference with people who would do it on social media platforms is that online retail platforms, people are more likely to sell goods rather than whether in, no, sorry, on social media platforms, you will have business pages for both goods and services. So a woman or man, but starting a page to advertise cooking classes and the teaching services, or but not only selling goods. The fourth type of profile, we're looking at is people working on food delivery apps, generating an income not on the driver's side, but on the kitchen side, so to speak. And finally, we wanted to include in our sample people working, especially women, working on crowd work platforms. The rationale behind including this type of profile was that we expect people who work on this type of platform to have a different skill set, maybe a higher level of education. Also, we know for sure that we would be dealing with people who have access to a computer and not only a phone, which is sufficient to conduct the other types of online activities we're looking at. But the one problem we hit is that actually, you know, the main crowdwork platform we were thinking about was Amazon Mechanical Turk. The 3 countries we're looking at are not part of the list of approved countries. So there is no such a thing as crowdwork platforms as the one we typically think about that support, you know, microtasking. But the type of what we found instead, and what we are included in our sample, is freelancers platforms. And actually, as opposed to crowdwork platforms, by definition, on freelance platforms, the providers will be providing entire services and not just micro tasks. So when it comes to the whole rationale that the people we are involving in our sample will have a different skill set, we have evidence that this is actually happening. Like, for example, in Myanmar, there is one platform called ChatSat, which is a freelancers platform where you see a lot of women selling services for, you know, web development, for communication and media work, like entire projects that what seems to happen is that the women who sell these type of services on these type of platforms actually don't really find, you know, a customer base outside the platform. And we are in a situation where we have people who have, for example, gone abroad and got a certain higher level of education that bringing it back home in their own country do not find a way to access to actually value these skills on the labor market outside of the platform. So in a sense, this is, I think, it's extremely relevant that we look at this type of job opportunities in these countries.
Thanks for that introduction, Huitam. And I want to use this as an opportunity to get into some of the distinctions that we might draw between different types of platform work. We're using that term expansively, I think, in the research project that you're leading. And, I think many of the issues that are often raised in the context of work quality tend to be imagining a particular kind of platform work where workers are kind of bidding for tasks, and the terms and conditions on which they work, whether they're doing sort of micro tasks from home or whether they're providing services in person, that oftentimes the platform firms have a lot of control over those terms and conditions. So certainly, the kinds of domestic work platforms that Bama was talking about would fall into that category. But in your work, Peitam, you're looking at a variety of different types of platform work. And so I'm curious if you can give us kind of a framework for thinking about quality of work across these different types of platforms, comparing, for example, a woman who is selling goods that she produces herself on a marketplace like Etsy, or acting as an online retailer through Facebook, comparing those types of income generation activities to the forms of platform work that are most, kind of conventionally thought about when we imagine these employment arrangements. And I want to invite Janine and Bama to also jump in on this question, because I'm sure that you've thought about this in your own work, even if you've focused more on certain types of work than others. But we'll start with you, Peitam.
So to speak to the question of quantity versus quality, I would say that what seems to happen is that the quantity of opportunities, might increase tremendously, like in terms of ability to access a job opportunity, just because when it comes to e-commerce platforms, especially for women who have a sense, a taste for starting their own business as a micro entrepreneur, so to speak, a lot of the weight, of the risks that comes with starting a business is taken off their shoulders because they are using a platform to start selling goods or services. And so the barriers to an entry, in a sense, are lifted for just to get it started. But then when it comes to the quality of work, and the ability, to use Janine's term, but to turn this opportunity that starts as a side gig into a decent source of a decent form of work, a decent source of income, is actually, this is something we really need to look at, like how reliable is it? How possible does it become? Especially knowing that this facility, that comes with starting with the platforms to start the business is given to many people, and many people, more and more people are using it. So the competition is actually really fierce on those platforms, and it makes the ability to turn this side gig into a primary form of employment even smaller every day. So this is something that has come up, in the few interviews that we conducted, the fear of competition, of saturation coming really soon, and the challenges that come to when it comes to leveraging this type of the initial side gig into a decent form of employment. I don't know if I answered your question correctly.
I have a question for you about that data point, and I don't know if you have more data on this, or Greg or Janine, if you do. And that is, I don't work on entrepreneurship. I'm, been focused on employment, but I'm just familiar with the statistics on small businesses. I'm, doing this call from Washington, D.C. and in the United States. For every 10 startups, 9 fail and only 1 succeeds. That's been, the statistic batted around for years. And I'm very curious, given this dramatic lowering of barriers to entry, if we're seeing an exponential rise in the number of failures per success. I mean, is it now 20 to 1 or 100 to 1 of success versus failures?
So honestly, in my work so far, we don't have any way, of quantifying this, but we do get a sense that there is there is a sense of vulnerability that comes with, I mean, sorry, I'm going to rephrase this. So far, what we've heard is more like kind of the women we talk to doubt, you know, that it will be possible to have this become, when they start their own business, to have it become more than what it is in their current life circumstances, which is a little something that they do on the side that they're very happy to include. You know, they have a real flexibility, at least at first in the short run, to choose their own schedule, to make it fit within the wide range of other responsibilities that they have that do constitute barriers to participation in the formal labor market. But when it comes to the possibility to have this become something bigger, the stories we hear is that it might not be possible, you know. So far, it's just like a welcome extra income, a welcome extra activity, something fun, something that enables to get some income for something that is more like play, you know, and leisure. So this is like, yeah.
I mean, I think there's another question there maybe that merits further research for the broader audience here. And that is, there's still, it's not as though there's complete lack of, you know, entry fee. There's still a capital outlay required. So I just wonder if we have enough data for policymakers to assert that platformization is creating opportunities, when in fact it may be creating opportunities for individuals to get excited and put out capital outlays that then are not recouped, which then leaves even more people vulnerable economically than in the first instance, where the cost to entry was a little more, you know, firm.
Mm-hmm.
So again, just a question for somebody's further research.
I think that's a great.
Yeah, sorry, I'll just add one piece of. Can I answer this one, Greg?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. This is something that comes up as well. You know, that there is kind of a threshold after which women who would want to turn their initial investment and initial, both in time and in money, you know, but their initial initiative into something bigger, at some point it would need a lot of investment, again, both in time, in terms of time and money. And then they are stuck in the situation where, in fact, you know, even though they're able to work from home and to make it fit within all of the other things they have to do, that burden of domestic work has not been lifted whatsoever. So it's basically impossible to make fit more of that work in there. And the fact that they are working from home, they are telling us, you know, I don't really have the opportunity, even though I'm happy to build a small community, both with my customers and with my other people who do the same type of activity online. Actually, I don't have access to larger networks, which at some point in the world of business is necessary to make your business grow. Outside of the online platform, in the online world and the domestic world, they are still in, you know. So it does represent some form of a ceiling for the business to grow.
Janine, I also want to bring you into this discussion because I think, you know, you started us off by also talking about the need to sort of regulate and shape the nature of platform work in order to ensure that it is creating higher quality forms of employment. And I wonder, you know, how should we be thinking about these different forms of platform work when it comes to regulation and labor market policy? Because, you know, some of the forms of platform work we're talking about are really pretty traditional kinds of wage work, just now being mediated by this new technology. And then other kinds are pretty traditional forms of small business creation, now being mediated by an online platform. So in the category of these small businesses that might be operating on Etsy, for example, you know, if it is the case, you know, at a macro scale, that what Huitan is observing in Southeast Asia and what Bama has mentioned, if it is the case that these are, very kind of marginal side businesses that they're bringing in a little bit of income to support the household, but they're really not full-time employment in any sense, and that they have a high rate of failure. What does that mean from a policy and sort of regulatory standpoint? I mean, how should we be thinking about translating this kind of opportunity into, what the ILO would consider decent work?
Right. Okay, so I haven't studied the small business platforms that much. I thought the statistic that Bama gave was really interesting. Now, to a certain extent, if there's a higher rate of failure, but you haven't put out a capital outlay, then it's not so bad. But if you are putting out a lot of investment and there's a higher rate of failure, then it's really highly problematic. And so what I've seen in the freelancing platforms, which are different but might have some similarities, which I find is a disturbing trend and does need some sort of governance, is that a lot of the workers, well, first of all, the workers are essentially paying to work because they pay a commission to the platform. And this is something that, historically through international labor standards, there's been standards against fee charging to the workers. It's to the employer that hires the worker, not to the worker themselves. So that's problematic. But also a lot of platforms have the business model where, because there's so much competition on the platforms, if you have a profile and you want to have greater visibility, they entice you to join and become a premium member or some sort of status in the membership. And then these workers are then paying a monthly membership fee. And so now you see that the platform business model has shifted, and really what they really are making money just off the workers on the platforms. And so this is a problem. On the Upwork platform, I looked at the data for 2018, only 8% of the workers had made more than $1. So, I mean, that gives you a sense of how competitive these platforms are. So not only do we need some sort of governance for these platforms, but what I really want to I think the real important message is so many countries have looked at these platforms as the panacea for their employment problems. So this is a way for the workers not to have to migrate, and here they can have a job that they get paid in foreign exchange, and our labor force problems will be resolved. And what we see instead is not only is it magnifying a lot of the problems that we see just in the offline labor market, but it's adding new dimensions because you have the return of these practices that had been banned in the past, such as fee charging. You have the data issues that Bama talked about that are real and that are serious. And so you have this whole other dimension, and then you have the whole planetary aspect, which makes it so hard to regulate this because it's across borders. So, I mean, I think, there are certainly a lot of nice success stories on the platforms, and I don't want to say that they're all negative and that there aren't opportunities. I think some people have done really well, but there's certainly a lot of network effects. It's a lot of first mover advantage. If you joined a freelancing platform or if you joined Etsy years ago when it first started, you will have built up a network and you will be doing really well. If you're joining today, it's not going to be the same situation. And so I think, again, it's another lesson for countries in the global South to say, okay, so to what extent can we benefit from these platforms? To what extent should we be creating our own domestic platforms or having regional platforms or some sort of maybe state governed platforms where you wouldn't have these practices such as fee charging? You would have some sort of forums for workers to go to if they have a problem. I think it's just an example of how policymakers can't just sit back and watch. They really need to be active in this space and think about how we can govern this better.
That's great. I want to surface two more policy issues and discuss them before we close the conversation. One is really around home-based work itself and to what extent policies should promote, encourage, or facilitate the expansion of women's labor force participation from home. And I think this is an important policy question because home-based work, I think, is oftentimes seen as kind of a sort of low-hanging fruit in order to increase women's labor force participation, given that, as we've discussed or at least alluded to, women have these very high care burdens. They do a lot of unpaid care work. There's a lot of expectation on women around the world to take care of domestic responsibilities. And so they're spending or confined to the home a lot in the first place. And so and encouraging participation from home is often seen as kind of an easy or easier pathway to enhancing their economic inclusion. But as Bama raises in her paper, by relying on these strategies or even promoting them, we're also reinforcing the same, gender norms that confine women to the home or burden them with unpaid care work to this disproportionate degree. And I think this is a real policy question, a really important policy question. Do we take the low-hanging fruit, which might have a marginal sort of benefit to an individual woman who has a little bit more income, perhaps as a result, a little bit more bargaining power in her own household because she's participating in some kind of economic activity and bringing in some kind of income from home? Or do we really double down on sort of the long-term strategy of, no, we need to create employment that women can access that is outside the home because we know it to be sort of more empowering over the long run for their economic inclusion and empowerment in society more broadly. So, and maybe I'm setting up the question too simplistically, which our panelists will call me out on and maybe nuance this a little bit. But what should the message to policymakers be in the global South who are facing these chronic, long-standing social norms around gender that aren't going to change in 5 years or even in 20 years, and who are trying to increase women's economic inclusion? How should they be thinking about home-based work? And that question is to anyone.
Okay, I can jump in. I have a strong piece of advice to policymakers, and that is deal with the structural factors. You will only exacerbate long-term economic exclusion of women if you do not deal with the structural factors. There are two really huge structural factors that must be addressed if we ever want to see meaningful participation of women in the economy. One, we have got to reduce and redistribute the unpaid care burden. That has to happen. Two, we have to address and reduce gender-based violence. Okay, that has to happen. If we do not do those things, we will not include women in the economy. And supply side will not do it. Saying to women, you now can get on a platform, will not do it. It will neither alleviate the realities of the unpaid care burden, nor will it actually make them safe. As I talked about a little bit earlier, they'll just become unsafe online. The surveillance economy may make things worse for them and their children. I think we've all started to see reports. There was one in The Guardian last week of call center workers that are required to keep their monitors on video, meaning their children may be in the background and their images are captured by the companies as well. We will be rendering new generations of people unsafe and at risk of violence. So we must deal with these two structural factors. It does not matter what supply side interventions you want to create if you haven't taken away the things that most keep women from entering the labor force in the first place.
I can add to this. I like the evidence we find in Cambodia, Myanmar, and Thailand very much supports what you're saying, Bama, about the structural gender inequalities, that whether it happens on online platforms or offline, they're just there. And they need to be addressed, like tackled, regardless of the form that labor takes. And when it comes to the question of personal safety, for example, the women who sell services, for example, we have like massage therapists, maids, people who do go to the house of people they have never met before in real life, and all of the negotiation happens online. The fact that these transactions are faceless makes people actually feel, the women we talk to feel extremely vulnerable. And whether it happens, you know, in the physical space, or actually the fact that the transaction takes place in the domestic space of the home, but then still throws them out there. And this vulnerability, the personal safety issue that is well known, you know, like happening disproportionately to women in the physical public space in particular, still happens to the person, even though like the vulnerability still is there, you know, in online. So this is just an example, like some of the really heartbreaking stories we heard of women feeling just extremely vulnerable, selling their services, and also having to rely, just like this, on their body image, you know, the femininity of their body image in order to get customers, to grow their business. So these structural issues are just there and maybe even exacerbated, and especially pervasive in the sense that they are in a way invisible and really hard to track. So I think for policymakers, this is something to be really especially attentive to, in the sense of looking out for the production of other gender inequalities and the reproduction and exacerbation of existing ones that we know way too well about.
Janine, do you want to weigh in on this particular topic, or?
Yeah, okay, so very quickly, because I think we're kind of getting to the end of our time. I mean, from the report that we published last year on working from home, so we took kind of a historical view of working from home, and there's always been women working from home, and for many women that's all they can do. You know, it's all they can do, and they want to continue doing it, so it's not something we should outlaw. There have been times in the past where home-based work was outlawed, and that wasn't necessarily beneficial for women. But it's true definitely that you have to deal with the structural factors. So we found, you know, for example, there's a lot of studies that show that many of the women take on this work. They think that they combine it with, you know, having their children at home. They realize they can't. They have to put their kids to bed, and then they work from 10 p.m. until 2 a.m. just to get up the next day. So all of the things that women who leave the house need, or not women and men who leave the house need to go to work, such as childcare and all of those basic services that are needed for people who leave the home are needed for people who work from home as well. And so I think that that's really more of the message that we should, you know, it's also men's burden, and children are the burden of the whole society. And so what can we do to alleviate that burden for working parents? And then whether the working parent wants to work from home or work outside of the home, you know, is up to that parent.
Great, thanks. Well, I'm really thankful and grateful that we had such an excellent group of scholars and practitioners here for this discussion. And I think there were a lot of really important issues that were raised, and some very sort of clear messages to policymakers in South and Southeast Asia who are trying to grapple with these changes in the labor market. Before we close, I thought I would just highlight a few of the things that I think came out of this discussion. I think one very clear message that emerged from our conversation is that we really cannot see these labor platforms, whatever form they take, whether it's the crowd work platforms or, you know, the online marketplaces, we really cannot see them as a panacea for employment challenges, very deep employment creation challenges that face a lot of countries in the global South. That the same sort of dimensions of extremely high competition and saturation of labor markets, which drives down the quality of work and wages. Those same factors that play out in, you know, the labor market at large are also playing out in the kinds of platforms that we've been talking about. So I think that's one really important message, that this is not going to solve the jobs crisis of many global South economies. I think another, you know, really clear message that came out of this, and particularly in this last round of comments, is that we will not address the broader challenges and marginalization that women face in the labor market through these technologies, and that the same kinds of structural factors, whether it is gender-based violence or the unpaid care work burden, or even just gendered divisions of labor that tend to relegate women to lower wage work, that those structural factors really have to be addressed in order to improve quality of work for women, both on and offline. And that in many cases, these online forms of work are reinforcing and even amplifying some of those existing structural inequalities that women face. So I think that's a really important message that has come from this discussion. And then the last sort of point that I would raise, which I think hopefully is something that we get to talk about more in future discussions on this, is really the data governance problem that Bama has raised a couple of times. That the volume of data that's being collected through these platforms about workers is a significant concern for their privacy, for their safety, and as Bama said, even for the privacy and safety of their families, and that this is something that really needs more attention from policymakers and from researchers to understand what the implications are of the sort of surveillance economy that's being created through these platforms. So I think these are some really keen, important insights. I think this has been a really rich discussion. It went longer than I anticipated, which I think is a good sign. And I just want to thank all three of you, as well as Ramiro, for taking time out of your day to share your research and your insights with us. We're really very appreciative and look forward to future discussions on this topic and related ones.